I'm once again going to be collecting a Paul Was Right award because I made a video last week saying that the Trump TikTok deal smelled like an oligarch handout straight out of Vladimir Putin's playbook. But the reality turns out to be that and somehow so much worse. Just why did Trump's friends just make billions while regular Americans get hung out to dry and pumped full of propaganda? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to talk about that, but more importantly, why this is a bad deal for the American economy. Let's get into it. Now, be sure to hit the subscribe button, guys. And also, you notice that my content has taken a little bit of a turn to more call out what I see as BS by our own government. And that's not a very profitable or advertiser-friendly thing to do. So if you want to support me, you can do it on combatvetnews.com. Become a member. Help me and the team continue to make independent videos where I can speak truth to power. This is literally hosted only by me because I got mysteriously kicked off of Patreon last year. Can't imagine why. So the link is in the description, and I appreciate all you guys that do support us over there. So now here's the facts. The reality of the White House's so-called TikTok deal, i.e. the forced sale or divestiture of TikTok from the Chinese, has, well, been announced, and it values the company at what sounds like a staggering $14 billion, right? That's a lot of dinero. But the reality is that this actually is a total gimme to Trump and his allies. Now, the Reuters reporting really being pretty generous here, saying that the new U.S. company, right, because TikTok is going to be sold from the Chinese and going to be incorporated as a U.S. company with new owners, will be valued at $14 billion, putting a price tag far below some analyst estimates. And we're going to break down just how far below we're talking about here. But of course, you might recall that the president unilaterally delayed the sale of TikTok as despite being legally required to be divested or shut down by January 20th. But the administration was hammering out some kind of divestiture deal with the Chinese, which is not how any of this is supposed to work. U.S. law says get rid of your company, and you just get rid of your company. But the Oval Office, of course, has had, there was some resistance on the Chinese side. The Chinese, by the way, have not officially approved it. The U.S. says, don't worry, Xi is totally on board, but totally on board is not the same thing as a done deal. But again, their goal, or the White House's goal, is to keep TikTok operating, but make sure that Americans' data privacy and other laws are complied with. But the reality is a little bit different than that, right? Now, Trump has said TikTok has 170 million U.S. users. This is important, right? And he said that the new consortium that owns it is going to include Michael Dell of Dell Technologies, Rupert Murdoch from Fox News Corp, and he said 4 or 5 world-class investors. But these are reportedly including people like Trump ally Larry Ellison. Now, first, I want to point out the important details here. $14 billion for a social media platform sounds like a lot, but actually that values TikTok about the same as Snapchat. Now, bear in mind, guys, how many young people do you know are obsessed with Snapchat? Not that many. And the data bears this out. While neither Snapchat nor TikTok US are reportedly profitable, TikTok US pulls in more than twice the revenue of Snapchat. While Snapchat's total revenue for their entire global operation is $5 billion, TikTok in the US alone pulls in over $10 billion of total revenue, including ads and other revenue streams like TikTok Shop. Now, what you're buying for that $14 billion on Snapchat is about 105 million US users. In contrast, TikTok has 70% more active users in America. So what they're saying is you're paying Snapchat prices to get a TikTok. To give you an analogy, most people value TikTok, which is a high growth company, not a sort of mature social media platform like Snapchat. Most analysts would put TikTok at around $40 billion. So what does that mean? Well, to give you a house analogy, this would be the equivalent of a house in your neighborhood where every house on your street is worth $1 million. This is the equivalent of having that house go up for sale for about $300,000. And what would you do if that happened? Well, you'd put in an offer. Why? Because even if you don't really care about the house, as soon as you purchase that $1 million home, you sitting on $1 million, or you owe $300,000 on $1 million house. You've suddenly conjured up $600,000 worth of equity, right? Now, here's the thing. You'd say, Paul, that would never happen. If you listed a house at $300,000, everyone and their brother would put in offers and the house would go for $1 million. Well, that's what would happen or should have happened with this TikTok deal. But you might notice that other companies, or even you and I, were unable to access this TikTok deal in any capacity. Now, bear in mind, TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is publicly traded on the Chinese stock exchange. You could buy shares in it, or at least you could have before. And Snapchat is also publicly traded. You and I could buy shares of Snapchat. In fact, if you invest in the S&P 500, if you have a pension, you probably have invested, in fact, in Snapchat. But this is a problem, is that you and I were blocked out of any chance to make the TikTok deal. Not only that, but any of the large banks, investment firms, hedge funds were prohibited from getting access to this deal. And so this is, again, the equivalent of that house going up for sale on your street, but the owners know. In fact, maybe it's your parents' house. And your parents say, it's going to be for sale, but it's not really for sale for everyone. It's for sale for you. And so you go, and they say, for you, $300,000, right? Well, that's what has happened with TikTok. It wasn't for sale for you and I. It was for sale only to the White House's buddies. And those White House's buddies got to buy, no shit, a $10 billion company, something making $10 billion a year, for $14 billion. Just think about that. Imagine you could buy a business that would pay for itself in just, 14 months of operations? Literally, before the midterms, this deal will have paid itself off from TikTok. This is a preposterous handout. Again, you're talking about $30 billion going to some of these other folks, these other investors. Now, again, there's a consortium. Rupert Murdoch of Fox News, obviously a super Trump loyalist, truly probably one of the person singularly most responsible for getting Trump into office and continuing to kind of whitewash his insanity. But what I want to point out is one of the other acquirers is the world's richest man, Larry Ellison. And Larry Ellison is problematic in his own kind of way. And I want to make note of this, is that Larry Ellison's political contributions have included, of course, frequent contributions to Republicans, almost exclusively. He also seethes and copes and hates people like Edward Snowden, who, again, leaked the NSA's sprawling data collection. So he's not exactly one of those privacy libertarian Republicans. He's more of a absolute control kind of Republican. Right, he's hosted Donald Trump fundraisers at his estate, donated $15 million tranches to all kinds of Republican senators, and made one of the most significant financial contributions of the 2022 election cycle. He also reportedly dropped in on a conference call to help President Trump in 2020, to help President Trump figure out how he was going to create the legal fiction that the 2020 election was fraudulent. It was not. The 2020 election was completely free and fair, and Trump lost. And anyone who says otherwise is trying to subvert democracy. So he's not exactly a lovely guy. But even worse, he's also is a U.S. citizen, but has donated tremendously, not to, of course, the U.S. military or to veterans, but to friends of the IDF. Interesting that he would donate literally $20 million. Some accounts have it being even more than that, to literally funding a foreign military's operations. So this does not feel like someone who is out here going to bat for the American voter, the American citizen. This is somebody who cares more about, again, a foreign country, more about Republican politics. And he is now part of this consortium that is in control of TikTok. And in fact, even more disturbing is that, well, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has come out and said, guys, we're really glad to see our people acquiring TikTok. He said, listen, we have to fight with the weapons that apply to battlefields where we're engaged in. This is a direct quote from Netanyahu. He continues, and the most important one is social media. He said that the deal to acquire TikTok by pro-Israel businessmen, he said was, quote, the most important purchase going on right now. Now, he also said, of course, X is the other most important platform, and Netanyahu said we have to get Elon Musk to be not an enemy but a friend. Now, this is like, I mean, again, his willingness to just come out and say these things is preposterous. He said that if Israel can get influence over TikTok and X, Israel would, quote, get a lot, unquote. Which, again, I want to point out, the like absolute absurdity of this is just mind-boggling. But because the reason that TikTok was divested from the Chinese is because it was seen as a foreign country whose interests are its own, using its control of the American algorithm to weigh its finger onto the American public, to use it to push propaganda and pro-Chinese and generally anti-American or highly divisive sentiments. But it is not better to sell it to people who are full-throated supporters of a different country. You haven't made TikTok better, you've made it worse. And in the process, because you've transferred tens of billions of dollars to the president's allies. What does this, why is this? So this is a problem, obviously, because we as Americans should have had a right to attempt to purchase shares in this, or at least other American hedge funds or companies should have had a right to bid this company up to its full market value. But there's a fundamental rot here that we need to talk about, and that is the use of political capital or crony capitalism. Now, what is crony capitalism? Well, crony capitalism is a concept that refers to the idea that you have a free market, but the most important thing that firms compete on is not price, it's not quality, it's not service, it's not brand, it is political influence. That is the most important facet of capitalism in crony capitalism. And here's the quintessential story for it. It's called loans for shares, right? Now, let's go back in time to Russia in 1995. The Russian government is pretty broke, and more importantly, needs to make sure that it has powerful people inside state industries as friends. So what does it do? Well, the Russians say that in order to ensure that Russia transitions to a free market economy completely, ownership of Russia's most valuable resources were auctioned off by oligarch-owned banks under a scheme called loans for shares. Supposedly, these banks were just acting on behalf of the state, but the process ended up being rigged by banks and oligarchs, and only banks who were permitted to place bids on these key Russian industries, right? These are things, to give you context, this would be like the Russian government's nickel mines, the Russian government's shipping operations, the Russian government's oil operations, the Russian government's steel manufacturing, Russian government shipping, Russian government gas and oil transport companies, pipelines. These were state-owned industries, government-owned industries that were now being put up for auction. But here's the problem. The only people allowed to bid were friends of the government. And so they ostensibly put them up for auction, but everyone, the insiders, had already carved up the pie. They all had already decided who was going to get what. And as a result, one example, a Russian oligarch named Khodorkovsky got a 78% share in Yukos, an oil company worth about $5 billion, and he paid just $310 million for it, which meant that, you may notice, he instantly became a billionaire, right? Because he owned something that was worth $5 billion. He got a $5 billion Pokemon card and he purchased it for just $310 million. Berezovsky got Sibneft, another oil giant, worth $3 billion for just $100 million. And this is, right, the government, of course, collected no taxes on these. And what it minted was a class of Russian oligarch. And these oligarchs, of course, have become deeply embedded in Vladimir Putin's worldview and his universe and his support structure. And this is the fundamental reality, is that these individuals, they call themselves businessmen, but these oligarchs, what they had, the thing that was worth billions of dollars, was not that they knew how to run an oil company better. It's not that they were going to make nickel mines more efficient. It's not that they even started a scrappy gas transport operation from nothing. They had political connections. They knew how to get inside the room when these industries were being auctioned off, and they ended up getting it for a steal. Now you may say to yourself, Paul, corruption happens all the time. There's all these private companies. I'm a regular American investor. I can't buy SpaceX. I can't buy OpenAI. I can't buy any private company. And that's a little bit true, right? The American system has this accredited investor system that's actually not, that is still pretty democratized. But when you have a majority of your country's economic activity governed by this crony capitalism, by the fact that the most important thing a Russian oligarch does to sustain his business is remain in good terms with Vladimir Putin, right? Running the nickel mine better, running the gas industry better, those are not important. What is important is making sure you have the government's favor. Well, what happens when you have an industry like this, right? What happens when you run a whole country this way? Well, I want to show you the GDP per capita of Russia since this deal was made, right? We'll take it to 1995, the year the deal happened. So here, Russian state government rolls out this crony capitalism. It hands their largest industries over to these insider oligarchs, and they have an initial economic collapse, a total collapse, in fact. They went from nearly a $3,000 GDP per capita down to just $1,300, literally cutting their GDP per capita in half. But then you might say, Paul, well, it experienced some growth, but then, well, what happened? Well, you see, in 2013, essentially Russian growth ground to a halt because, well, industries that were competitive 10 years ago and have suffered from chronic underinvestment eventually just sort of stall out. And that's what has happened. Since then, the Russian economy has never recovered on a GDP per capita basis. In fact, you can see that the growth rate of Russian GDP per capita, again, after about 2013, it's had actually more bad years than good years. It's actually been generally in decline since 2013. That's a bad 10 years. And that is a function, you might say, well, these are good times. And sure, this is a post-Soviet country that privatized. And it's going to have some economic growth because it literally was barely even a functioning economy. But this, you cannot sustainably run a free market economy in this way. Contrast this to Poland. Poland is another post-Soviet country, just as bad in every way as post-Soviet Russia. But what happened when they didn't do crony capitalism, when they didn't hand out the largest companies for pennies on the dollar? Well, the answer is they experienced a tremendously different growth trajectory. They had growing GDP per capita, a growing economy. And even in the 2010s, when things appeared to flatten out, they never experienced a Russian-style collapse. You can see 2013, right? The highest GDP per capita year that Russia ever experienced barely is even a blip, right? Poland shucked off that economic decline and was returned, which just in 5 years was already putting up higher numbers than ever. And it's continued to grow. You can see that again, 2013, the year that most Russian GDP per capita numbers started to shrink, Poland has had only 3. So again, I want to show you guys the model of non-crony capitalism, right? Where the free market ruthlessly competes, where things are always priced to market. The United States of America. How has the US done since 1995 in GDP per capita? It's done awesome. Barely even got touched by the 2008 financial crisis. GDP per capita just rocketing. Literally, only COVID could barely dent it. Look at this. I mean, look at these GDP numbers, right? Since 2013, we've had literally 1 year of GDP per capita reduction. This is when people talk about the American system, when people talk about the free market, this is what happens when you have a government that doesn't pick winners and losers, where companies don't have to sit there and go, well, what if the government doesn't like us anymore? Instead, these companies get to go, listen, we deliver, we compete not on political influence, not on how do we get inside the White House to do this deal. Companies say, hey, why? We need to make a better product. We need to be cheaper. We need to be faster. We need to be higher quality. And when you compete on that level, you produce an economy that delivers massive returns. Now, don't get me wrong. The American system for decades has been a long way from perfect. It's still had a lot of these influence peddling, but the fundamental basis, right, of the Russian economy, every major Russian industry relies on being favorable to the boss man, Vladimir Putin. And increasingly now we're seeing that the largest social media companies, right, America's biggest tech giants, are not relying on making a better social media platform, a more responsive algorithm, a better experience for advertisers. Those things are irrelevant. The most important thing that each of these companies has to do now is get the White House to like you. Because if you do, the White House will funnel billions of dollars into your company. Look at Intel. Intel literally went into the White House, and when they walked out, the White House had agreed to make a multi-billion-dollar investment. Well, actually, that's not even true. Intel was forced to hand over 30% of its company to the government, but in exchange, the government promised Intel, hey, a lot of favorable connections, favorable contracts, and we can see that the market has made clear that when the government decided to make Intel their best buddy, suddenly you see the price of those shares skyrocket. Not because Intel suddenly made chips better, not because Intel can compete against TSMC, but because they curried favor with the White House. This is not the recipe for competitive industries, right? This might limp along for a while, looking okay, but sooner or later, the companies that need to evolve or die, they're going to do neither. They're going to become government life support, just like all of these Russian industries. Gazprom, Norsk Nickel, Rosatom, they are producing inferior products at inferior prices, and they refuse to evolve with the times. And why should they? They don't want competition. They don't want free market capitalism. They want to maintain their friendship with Putin, which is the most important thing they have. Just like Intel, the most important thing it has now is the love and affection of the White House. And that's what's happening with these TikTok deals now. This deal has sent a signal all throughout the US markets that says, listen, you stand to make billions of dollars if your company kisses the ass of the people in the White House. And so if you're a company that says, listen, we can build a better phone, we can build a better search algorithm, we can build a better AI model, you go, or we could take that money, we could grease some palms in the White House and get our 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1 return on our investment. Anyway, guys, thank you so much to the Colonel Team members of Combat News, guys like Paul Wheeler, Michael Clean, Jeff Davies, Francis Carius, Thomas Anderson, and Eugenia Cuesta, as well as all of our Lieutenant Tier members. Couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate y'all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.